Hello. Today's topic, as you can see, is what is a text? Text is a word that's used in many ways. Today I want to define it in the sense that linguists use it. Now I'd like to start by doing that by taking you way back to something that it may seem very simple, but stick with me, right? Spelling, right? From the time you were a child in school, you learned about spelling. And in linguistic terms, a linguist might call this a tool, right? You learned a tool for seeing how language works. You learned the tool of spelling. You learned that we use individual letters and form them into words, right? Now, I'm talking about written language. In spoken language, you would instead say the sound. You could talk about the individual sounds, right? But for today, it's easier to talk about the written language. But any of the things I say apply to spoken language too. So spelling, we have letters become words. And what do I mean that this is a tool? Well, you probably started your learning of English at some point with ABC, right? And if I asked you to think about what does ABC mean, you'd probably say something like, well, they're letters, right? You might say that the first three letters. Eventually, you'd probably come up with saying something about how these are the first three letters of the alphabet, right? And that's very simple. But where your tool knowledge comes in is when you think about all the things you know about how these letters can be arranged in certain ways, some of which are acceptable and some of which aren't. And that's where you can think of this as a tool, right? If you see CAB, you probably know that that can be described as acceptable, right? That's a word, right? Cab is a word that you know presumably already because it's a reasonably simple word, right? But what about rearranging those letters into BAC? Now, is that a word? No, right? And you may say, well, it could be an acronym, right? Okay, fine. But that's not a word. That would be an acronym and it should be capital letters, right? So is BAC a word? No. But your knowledge of the spelling tool would tell you that this is an acceptable pattern, right? BAC on its own is not a word, but that BAC could appear in something like back, right? So CAB makes a complete word. BAC is not a word, but you've got something to work with there because of everything that you know about spelling, right? How about this, though? ACB. As far as I can determine, this is not an acceptable pattern in English spelling, right? It's certainly not at the start of a word, and I looked pretty carefully. There may be words where this appears somewhere in the middle of the word, but if so, it's not that common, right? And you could probably feel that both, by trying it to pronounce it. It sounds awkward, right? To picture ak in the middle of a word, certainly at the start of a word, and it just doesn't look right for you, I imagine, right? So you'd probably say this is not possible. Now, the next step up is grammar, right? If you picture starting from the small elements of language, for written language, letters become words, or for spoken language, individual sounds, individual phonemes are joined into meaningful sounds that are words. But then so we join the letters into words. How do we join the words up? Well, we have a thing called grammar, which again, at some point in your study of language, you probably looked at how grammar works, right? And you'd probably be able to do the same thing as we did on the previous slide, but at a bigger level now, right? If I asked you about this, if I said, he ate the apple, what can you tell me about that? Is that possible? Is that acceptable? Your knowledge of grammar, you'd say, yes, it is, right? He ate the apple is certainly possible. And if you remember the exact words, you'd know to call this a clause, right? A clause, it's got a subject, he, and it has a predicate, which for the easy thing to say about predicate is the verb and maybe whatever else there is, right? You could just have a subject and a verb, or in this case, you have a subject and a verb, ate, and the object, the apple, right? So what's a grammar, in grammatical terms, what does a clause need? It needs a subject and a predicate, right? Here we have subject he, predicate ate the apple. Fine, you don't need to know all that now. As I said, you would certainly know that if someone said he ate the apple, that just feels right. That's all I'm hoping that you see for now, right? It is technically a clause, yes. But then what about this, right? The apple he ate. Now, if you think back to the previous slide, when I had the letters BAC, and I said, is that a word? And probably you would say no, but you would then notice probably that, well, it's not a word on its own, BAC, but it could be part of a word. And I think you'd probably do the same thing with this. If I said, according to your knowledge of the tool that we call grammar, the tool that explains how language works, called grammar, is the apple he ate okay? And you'd probably come up with that, right? To say, well, it's okay so far, but it needs more, right? That this is a phrase in this case, because it doesn't have an enough to make a full clause, right? That we need something like, the apple he ate was delicious. Now it's okay, right? You've got the was delicious part added on that turns it into a complete clause. And now you'd say the apple he ate was delicious. Yeah, that's enough grammar for this to make sense. But if we took something like this, ate apple the he, where you've got the same words but rearranged in a different order, you'd probably say, no, that's not a clause, it doesn't work, and it doesn't feel like you can add anything else to it to make it work, right? It feels like it's just nothing. Although you should see the asterisk there before the word ate. That's a thing that's used, you'll see it in textbooks and so on. Linguists often use it to mean not possible, or at least highly unusual, right? It means that ate apple the he is probably not possible, but you could maybe go through a lot of work to make it somehow fit into a sentence and become part of a clause. Okay, fine. So instead of just saying that's why we often use the asterisk to say, look, for the most part, this is highly unusual or impossible, but we're not going to spend a lot of time trying to find one small example where it is possible, right? I think we can all agree ate apple the he is pretty unlikely. I mean, especially because it's got the before he there. That's a very unusual combination, right? So this is probably nothing. And there's a tool that you have. Start with spelling and build up to words. Start with words and build up to clauses by using grammar. But then for a lot of us, that's probably where we stopped, right? And what I want to talk about today is the next level tool, right? Which is, as it says here, we can combine clauses into what linguists call texts. This is a tool that I'm talking about today that, again, like with those other tools, you may not know how to describe this. Like you may have forgotten the word clause, but you certainly know how to do it. You know how to speak English or write English. You certainly know how to combine clauses into texts. Of course, it's something you do every day when you use more than one clause, right? When you write something or speak for more than one clause, you're creating what linguists call a text. You know how to do it. What I'm talking about today is the words we use to describe them. And so what is a text and what is not a text is where I will start. Now, what you've got to do first is put aside common layperson's definitions of text, right? Sometimes people just use text to mean words, right? They'll say, cut and paste the text from one document to the other, where they're not really referring to any linguistic properties of the words. They just mean the words themselves, right? Cut and paste the text, and they don't care what it is. It could just be the letter Z repeated over and over, and they might call that a text. The letter Z repeated over and over is not a text in linguistic terms, right? Sometimes people are referring to text as, send me a text, right? Short message service. Again, that's not what we're talking about here. Sometimes a book is referred to, right? A lecturer will say, please read chapter 7 of the text before our next class. Again, that's not what we're talking about, right? What we are talking about in linguistic terms is this, right? A text is a coherent set of words and or symbols that presents a message. A text is a coherent, so coherent means makes sense, right? They've got to be words that make sense somehow. So we're not talking about a group of random words. If you just flipped through the dictionary and picked 5 words at random and plunked them down, it's highly unlikely that would become a text in the linguistic sense, right? It's got to make sense. Coherent makes sense, right? We probably use the word incoherent more often. When we say someone was incoherent, we mean they're not making sense. Coherent, we mean they're making sense, right? words. We're focused on words here in linguistics, although the definition can include symbols, right? Symbolic, colors, right? Red meaning danger can be part of a text, right? You can write danger, or you can have a red sign with the word danger on it. So that you can have pictures, right? These can be part of the text, and I will talk about symbols a bit, but really we're focused on the words, right? And how those words and symbols make sense to present some kind of message to the reader or the listener. That's the definition of text. Let's talk in more detail about how to make sense of this definition. So first, a few examples, right? There may be things like this that you think of, that people often think of as more intuitively when you'd use a word like text, which sort of sounds linguistic-y, right? It sounds like it might be an advanced kind of word in the linguistic sense. So people tend to start thinking about stuff like this, that it's got to be great works of literature, right? That it's got to be something like Shakespeare here in front of you. But of course, this is a text too, just some mundane instructions for how to copy a PowerPoint template that you might find if you looked it up on the internet. In linguistic sense, this is a text, right? We have words that make sense together and present a message. The message here is maybe more obvious than the previous example. Right here, the message that's being presented is how to copy a template in PowerPoint. Songs are also texts. Here you're seeing the written version, but texts do not have to be written, right? When you hear a song, that's a text in the linguistic sense, right? If you were to hear this person singing it, that would be an oral text, right? And that's fine, so spoken or written. Text can be somewhat silly like this, right? As I was going up the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. I met him once again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away. How is this possible that you can meet someone who isn't there? And how can you meet him again? And how can he go away if he's not there? And it's all sort of not sensible if we think about it logically, but it certainly makes sense coherently as a text, right? I mean, it means something together. It means something, illogical. And it's coherent because you can see that the author of this had to work. These are not random words that are illogical. These are words that were put together in a very clear sequence in order to present that message of ambiguity, to make you think what's going on here. Text can be things like this, right, where we do now see the words themselves and the times, but we also see some of what it said on the definition, words and or symbols, right? You can think of the symbols here, of course, for the colors, where each this is a bus schedule for it may be too small for you to see, but what we have here is a bus schedule for some hotel buses, I believe. And you can see how the color coding helps, that each bus has its own color code. And it's also symbolic, the organization here, unlike all of the previous texts where you read starting on the left and you read left to right and then moving down the page. Here you would know, I think, that you should read by cross-referencing, right? By picking a column on the left and picking a row on the left and picking a column at the top and cross-referencing to find the time, right? If you want to live on this day at this time, this is this day in this place, this is the time, right? So this is also a text. The message presented is quite obvious, right? What time should you catch the bus? But it's not nearly as, what's the word? It doesn't seem nearly as exciting, maybe the wrong word, right? If we compare it to the song and to the Shakespeare and so on, it may seem a lot more mundane, right? A lot more plain, but in linguistic terms, it's certainly a text. Here we have a text that has quite a bit to it, right? When I wrote, one thing to think about here, I wrote at the top, restaurant menu, right? And if you look at it, you probably believe me that it's a restaurant menu. But an interesting thing to do if you want to pause for a minute is make a quick list of 3-4 items that convince you that this is a restaurant menu, right? I wrote that it's a restaurant menu, but do you believe me? Well, if you can read Japanese, then you would have a strong clue, right? That after, at the top there where it says KFC AM, the next line says morning menu, and then it says 7 a.m., 10 a.m., right? So it says menu, but even then, is it really a menu? How do you know? Pause for a second, think. What here tells you that this is really a menu? And I realize that you don't have to pause, I can't force you to, but this is the kind of thing where I think if you try it just for a bit, you'll get more of a feel for doing this, right? So please pause. And now you're back. And presumably your list would have something like, how do you know it's a restaurant menu? Well, maybe the time, the 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. that I already mentioned, right? Because that's the kind of thing you might see on a restaurant menu. The pictures probably are helpful. You are familiar with menus of a certain type of restaurant having pictures, right? Fast food restaurants, right? It's kind of strange, right? The cheaper the menu, the more information you get, right? You get to see an actual picture. More expensive restaurants where you're paying a lot more money, you don't actually know what you're getting because it's just written in written text, no images. And some very fancy restaurants are even more obscure, right? They may have, the menu may be in French and using words like, reduction and au jus instead of just saying a sauce, right? But anyway, but you know that, right? You know that what I'm doing here is talking, now you know this word genre, right? G-E-N-R-E. What I asked you, I didn't say it, but when I said, is this a menu? And how do you know? I was asking you to do a little bit of genre analysis, right? To analyze this genre of text and say, what are its features, right? If someone says to you, what does a restaurant menu look like? You must be then, if you can give an answer, you must be then picturing that genre in your head. What menus have I seen? What do they typically have? Okay. And then you'd come up with a list like I'm giving you right now, right? Times the restaurant's open, food items that are available, drinks as well. You can see prices on there. Each of those items, you'll see 2 numbers. The one with the thing that looks like a little Y, the bigger number is the price in Japanese yen. The number before it is the calorie count. That's something that restaurant menus sometimes have, right? And so that accumulation of generic features, right, the features of the genre, that accumulation of generic features allows you to say, oh yes, I recognize this text. It's a menu. It's a fast food menu. And you could probably do that even though you don't read Japanese, right? And of course, it says KFC at the top, so that might be a strong clue too. Good, right? So that is also a text. And doing that kind of genre analysis is first, when you see something or hear something, you hear a speech, you hear a conversation, you read a poem, you read a comic book, you must be going through this kind of process, right? First saying, is the thing I'm hearing or reading coherent? Does it make sense? In other words, is it a text? And then you start filtering it, saying, well, what kind of text is it? Oh, I'm hearing a song. How do I know it's a song? Because it's got these features. Oh, I'm hearing a poem. How do I know it's a poem? Because it's got those features. How do I know it's a novel? How do I know it's a cookbook? How do I know it's an instruction manual from IKEA? Whatever. You're starting to look at those generic features in order to categorize the text into one of a certain number of genres. Going way back to me saying, you may remember the definition said a text is words and or symbols. It's an or symbols. Could be just symbols. You are probably familiar with these 2 signs as not having any words, just symbolic, and yet in linguistic terms, these are texts because they present a message to you, right? You know that they mean something. What it says here is you don't need text to have texture. You don't need text in the classic sense of words in order to have texture. Texture means, did I put it here? Texture is that which makes a text a text. All of the features together that make something coherent and present a message. All of those things together are called the texture. Texture, I may have put it here. No, I didn't. But text and texture come from a Latin word, textus, Textus, which means weave, right? So when you weave something, you put all the bits of fabric together into making one bigger thing, right? You weave the stuff into making a blanket or what have you. So you can picture that here, right? Metaphorically, the text is made up of all the different elements woven together. Now this sign here, it says in what context would you see this sign, right? Context is a very important word. Con means with, right? Chili con carne means chili with meat. What context would you see the sign? In other words, not the text itself, not the words and or images, but where and when would you see it? That's part of the texture, right? Think about it for a minute. The answer is pretty obvious, right? So you don't need to think about it for a minute. You would expect to see this sign on a door, of course, and then it would make sense. And you would say, aha, that sign is on a door. That means this is the toilet, right? The context is important because imagine if you were walking through the park and you saw one of these signs on the ground, it wouldn't have that same texture. You wouldn't think, of course you wouldn't think, oh, this is the toilet. You'd think, someone has dropped this sign here on purpose or by accident, right? But you certainly wouldn't take it as a meaningful, presenting a message if you were to see it on the ground. So in this case, this is a good example, right? The texture of these signs, what makes them meaningful as text, is not just the sign itself, but also the placement matters, right? This has to be, pretty much has to be on a door somewhere for it to make sense. A door would be part of the texture of these signs. I said this sign, obviously, probably they would be two individual signs on different doors. Texture. So now let's look at more of what words we use to describe texture using examples of language as opposed to focusing on images like in the restaurant menu and the bathroom signs. Texture, right? If you just see this, right, put them in a cooking pot. Now, you have a clue here, right? I've italicized the word them. And if you look at it for a while, or even very quickly, you can probably figure out why I italicized the word them. Something is different about the word them here than all of the other words, right? They're all English words, of course, and they're all reasonably simple words, of course. But the word them is different than the other words because the word them can mean a lot of different things, right? Put and in and cooking pot have pretty common meanings, right? And I realize that, pot has a few different meanings, and pot, is it a big pot or a small pot or what have you? Yeah, okay. We don't know exactly what the pot is, but we know something about pot, right? A container for holding things, especially when cooking, right? Whereas them, if I asked you to describe them to someone, what does them mean? You'd probably have to say, well, it means different things depending on when someone says it, right? It means two or more of something, it's plural, and it is sort of like they, but it's different, and if you thought about it, you'd say, all right, them is used for the object of a sentence, whereas they is used for the subject. So them is two or more of something that are grammatically an object, but what are those somethings? I have no idea. There's no way to know. And there's no way to know from this sentence here, right? And that's why them is different. It's one of those type of words, and we'll see others as time goes on, it's one of those type of words where you need more in order to make sense of it. A useful distinction here is you might, if I asked you, do you understand this sentence? You'd probably say, yeah, I understand it. But in a linguistic word you could use is that you can understand each of these words, put them in a cooking pot, but you can't interpret the word them. And by interpret here, I mean, what does it mean this time, right? So them here is uninterpretable. You know that it means, you understand that it means two or more of something in the object position of a sentence, but you can't interpret what those two or more things are now. So them is uninterpretable here. We need more words to interpret them here. What does them mean? In a linguistic sense, you could mean at the moment, them is meaningless, it's uninterpretable. But now, of course, you can interpret the word them. All of you would be looking and saying, oh, I see, now I know what them is. Them is onions, or more specifically, large onions, more specifically, 2 large onions. To be absolutely specific, you know that what it means here is 2 large onions that you just cut up, right? And you could, of course, say that. You could say, cut up 2 large onions. Put the 2 large onions that you just cut up in a cooking pot. But, of course, you don't need to do that because the word them, although it's a different form, right? The 2 large onions you just cut up is one form, them is a different form, but they both have the same function, right? They both mean the same thing. So you can say here, now with this, right, here, put them in a cooking pot, them is uninterpretable. Here, them is interpretable as the 2 large onions you just cut up. So you needed the first sentence in order for the them in the second sentence to have texture, right? For it to weave together properly, you needed more words in this case. Those more words, I believe the word appears later, but I'll say it now to distinguish. Those more words are the co-text, C-O-hyphen-T-E-X-T. Here, them refers to the co-text, cut up 2 large onions, not the context. These 2 words are similar in spelling. They've got most of the same letters, but it's important to distinguish between them. When you say, put them in a cooking pot, them refers to other words in this text. Them refers to the co-text, cut up 2 large onions. Context means outside of the text, right? You could use them to refer to the context when you do something. When you point and you say, pass me them, and you point, now the person you're talking to would know what them is. That person could interpret them by seeing what you're pointing at in the context. Where are you? The kitchen. I point, I say, pass me them. You see that there are some cut up onions and you pass them over, right? So, cut up 2 large onions, put them in a cooking pot. Them is interpretable as the 2 large onions you just cut up because of the co-text. And as I said earlier, you really want to be specific. I know for convenience, it's easy to say them means onions, but you know really it means the 2 large onions that were mentioned in the first sentence, right? If you want to be specific, it's that and only that. Without the first sentence, the second sentence would not make sense. Again, you may say, but I understand the second sentence. Yes, but in the linguistic meaning of being coherent, of making sense, of being interpretable, I'm saying the same thing in different ways here, right? I'm giving you multiple ways of referring to the same thing. The second sentence, put them in a cooking pot, is only interpretable, it only makes sense when we have the co-text of the first sentence to refer back to. That is, I think I just used the word and now you see it at the top. That word them is a reference, right? It's a kind of word that is interpretable because it refers to something else, either something in the co-text, cut up 2 large onions, or something in the context when you say, pass me them, do you know them, have you seen them around lately, and you point, right? That sort of thing. And of course, you don't always need to point. It's often understandable, right? Someone says, what do I do with these? And I say, pass me them. That kind of thing too. I don't have to point, right? In this case, we have this word anaphoric. Them is an anaphoric reference. Anaphoric means pointing back, right? The phoric part means pointing. In order to understand them, you have to look back earlier in the text, right? It would apply to spoken language too. If you hear it and you think back, right? If someone says, my friend Shubham is coming, do you know him? You don't think to yourself, him, who's him? You think back through time, do you know Shubham? Whatever I said, do you know Shubham? My friend Shubham is coming, do you know him? him anaphorically refers back to Shubham, right? There's different ways of saying it, right? Him is an anaphoric reference to Shubham. Him refers anaphorically to Shubham. It just depends whether you want to use the words as a verb or an adverb or what have you, right? You'll see this, of course, more examples of this when you do the reading. You'll see how people write sentences using these words, and we'll practice later, of course. So them points back to the two large onions that were referred to in the first sentence. Anaphoric reference, as I just said. So another way of describing this, see at the top it says a cohesive relation. You know, cohesive means sticky, right? Cohesion is the noun. Cohesive is the adjective. You can use either, right? Another way to say this, look how the sentence is getting longer, but I think you know all of these words, or at least the phrase here. Anaphoric, cohesive relation, right? You have the word them, and you know it sticks to something else. Cohesive relation. Them sticks to something else. What does it stick to? It sticks to back to the cut up two large onions. Put the two large onions that you cut up in a cooking pot. And so now you start to see, oh yeah, these sentences are part of a text, right? That because you need the first sentence to interpret the second sentence, you can see that they stick together. And so you start to say, aha, these are not random sentences plucked from one book and another and stuck together. These two sentences belong together, and the word them is a sign of that. You may see other signs of that. Look at these two sentences for a second. This is something I'll talk about later, not today. But look at those two sentences. What's another clue that these two sentences are not random, that they belong together? Probably you will say, oh, right, there's the two large onions. The fact that they are onions and that cooking pot is mentioned is a strong clue too, right? Onions are food, or at least edible, and in some texts it may not be. You may be talking about farming onions or whatever, but here we're talking about onions and cooking, and that makes sense because onions are a thing that we cook. We don't tend to eat them raw. So you may say, oh, there's another sign. Yes, that's exactly right. Onions and cooking pot are cohesive, right? Because onions are put in a cooking pot. Them and two large onions, as we just said, are cohesive because them is a reference, an anaphoric reference to the two large onions. In fact, even cut and put are cohesive here, right? What is it? Think for a second. What is it that makes the two words cut and put seem like they belong together? Probably you would say something like, oh, right, well, they're both verbs, and they're both imperative verbs, right? Imperatives, right? Telling you to do something, right? Look at that. Come here. Be quiet, right? So they're both imperative verbs, and they're both doing verbs, like, they're not verbs like think for a moment, right? They're both verbs that involve action, and that makes them feel like they go together. And sure, right? Because if you've read any cookbook, if you've ever read a recipe, you'll know that there's going to be words like cut and put and slice and cook and so on, right? So there's in fact a lot of, three that I've named so far, three cohesive relations just in these two sentences: cut, put, two large onions, them, onions, cooking. There's in fact three different cohesive relations here. And we'll talk about them all over time. Right now I'm just focused on the reference, the fact that them refers to two large onions. So there's cohesion between them and two large onions. They stick together. Another word to add. There aren't many more, I promise. Presupposition. So you've got the word suppose here, to guess, right? You know when someone says, like, is it going to rain tomorrow? I suppose, I guess, right? So suppose is just in that sense, to suppose something. Ahead, right? So a word like them is said to contain a presupposition. It's not that the word them is, don't say the word them is a presupposition. The word them, in this case, is a pronoun. It's a pronoun being used as a reference. It's a pronoun being used as an anaphoric reference, right? But what presupposition means is it's a part of the word, not what the word is, but at least a part of the word. Think of it that way, or built into, as it says here. When you use a word like them, for listeners and or readers, if they hear a word like them, they will presuppose, they will guess that ahead, or sometimes after, but most of the time it's ahead, earlier in the text, they will guess that they can understand this word, that they can interpret this word from earlier in the text. That's all it means, right? You see the word satisfy. It's kind of unsatisfying in some way, right? If someone says, why don't you ask him? If you can't interpret him, you will be unsatisfied, right? If someone says, where can I get advice on financial planning? And someone says, why don't you ask him? Well, then you may say, but who's him? That's not a satisfying answer, because him presupposes that elsewhere in the text or the cotext, elsewhere in the cotext or the context, that I will find an answer. So where can I get help with financial planning? Why don't you ask him? You'll think that doesn't work, right? It doesn't seem satisfying. I need to say, why don't you ask him, and point at him? Or there has to be someone mentioned earlier, right? Where can I get help with financial planning? Do you know Dr. Harrison? Why don't you ask her? And then you go, her means Dr. Harrison. Now you're satisfied, right? So that's what presupposition means. Presupposition, think of it as meaning, presupposition, what does this word mean this time, right? Them, that's another way to think of it. Them, if I ask you what does them mean, just that without the sentences here, if I say what does them mean, you can't really answer. You can only say, well, it means two or more of something. But if I say, how about in this example text, you could say them presupposes the two large cut up onions. That's what them means this time, right? Them presupposes two large cut up onions. If I say, do you know Dr. Harrison? Ask her. Her presupposes Dr. Harrison. That's the way it works, right? That those kind of words have that built into them. The expectation that for them to make sense, right? For them to work as part of a text, listeners or readers will have the expectation that they can understand that word from elsewhere in the cotext or from the context. That's what I just said, right? Them presupposes that somewhere in the text we will discover the meaning of them. Them should be in italics here, the second them, sorry. Other types of words contain these presuppositions. You hear them and you suppose that earlier in the text or sometimes later, but usually we use them to refer to earlier things. It's possible to refer forward, right? When you say something like, listen to this. What does this mean? You know, this means something. It presupposes something, but you don't know what yet, right? Listen to this. I heard a joke, and now you know that this refers forward to the joke. That does happen for effect, but most of the time we refer back, anaphoric, right? Which is why I used that term first. Other types of words contain presuppositions, right? Look at this example. I'll have the same. Look at this example. I think so. Look at this example. Yes, I have. I advise you to pause for a minute and think carefully about which word or words in these three examples. These are three separate examples. It's not supposed to be one little story, right? Just think of those three separate sentences. But think about how there are words in each that where something is missing, some information is missing that you need to find somewhere else, that you presuppose that if the person talking to you is trying to make sense, if the person talking is trying to trick you, well then they can say whatever they want. But if they're trying to make sense, you would expect to find the meaning of these words in other places. So please pause and think about that. And now that you're back, so in the first sentence, let me see if I know. So in the first sentence, think of the same, right? I'll have the same. If I tell you I'll have the same, what is the same? It needs to refer to something else, right? We need that co-text perhaps where someone says, I'll have, you're having breakfast at a restaurant, someone at a cafe, someone says, I'll have the bacon. I was going to say bacon. Yeah, breakfast, bacon and eggs. Someone says, I'll have the bacon and eggs. And someone else says, I'll have the same. In other words, the same presupposes I'll have bacon and eggs like she ordered. And of course, it doesn't mean the same. It doesn't mean when someone says, I'll have bacon and eggs, and someone says, I'll have the same, I'll have those bacon and eggs. you're not stealing it from them, right? You're saying, I'll order the same thing. So the same would presuppose bacon and eggs like what she ordered, but a separate plate, please. I think so. It's the word so here, right? Where so, we use the word so very often in English because it's got other functions like so big, where it means very big. But here so doesn't mean very. It's going to refer back to as much as you want from the previous sentence or sentences, right? Someone might have said, are you going to go to that party on Friday night that I told you about last week when you and I were talking to John? And you say, I think so. And you know that here so presupposes that whole thing. You're saying, I think I'm going to go to that party that you told me about last Friday night when we were standing around talking to John. Yes, I have. Here, this is a little bit trickier, but it's still something. There's still a presupposition here, but here a presupposition is actually in the blank space after the word have, right? Have you ever played tennis? Yes, I have. And now the presupposition is something is actually taken out, right? Have you played tennis? Yes, I have. You could say, yes, I have played tennis. But someone says, have you played tennis? You can just say, yes, I have. And the missing played tennis is presupposed. In fact, it could be even shorter, right? If someone says, have you played tennis? And you say, yes, you know that what's really meant is, yes, I have played tennis. But you can leave out that whole clause, I have played tennis, and just, it exists as a presupposition. Have you ever been to Korea? Yes, I have. Now, the space after have doesn't mean played tennis, it means been to Korea. Have you ever eaten spaghetti? Yes, I have eaten spaghetti. Yes, I have. Now the space presupposes eaten spaghetti. So you can even leave things out, but rely on the listener or readers being able to interpret what's missing there, because we know that's how language works, because we know that sometimes things are not said directly. You can say the same or so, or sometimes things aren't said at all, but if we assume the other person's trying to make sense, we look for that presupposed information. We see that if you hear yes, I have, you know that it presupposes that the have what is found elsewhere in the text. And we'll talk more about those later, those places where we leave things out. Today we're doing a general overview, right? Look at almost every word in this sentence, right? Again, you might want to pause. So we pushed him under the other one. Almost every word in this sentence presupposes that the information will be found elsewhere. Pause for a sec. And now you're back, right? What words in this sentences have presuppositions? We, who's we? Me and you, me, you, and him. Is it inclusive we, all of us, or is it an exclusive we, me, and them, but not you, right? We're going to lunch. What are you doing? Him, who's he, right? Which person is it? Other one, you have to know what the first one is before you can know what the other one is, right? Even one itself, you know that one doesn't always mean 1, 2, 3, right? Sometimes one means something. I can say, I've got a red pen. Do you want the blue one? The blue one means the blue pen. Now one means pen, right? All of those involve presupposition. Even so, right? The so here presupposes that this is the effect of some cause, right? Something he did caused us to push him under the other one. I don't know what it is. I don't need to know. There is, because all of these words have presuppositions. We'd have to be part of this conversation or listening or in the physical space where someone's telling the story in order to understand, in order to interpret, I should say, in order to interpret all of these presuppositions. It could be part of the context, right? I've used this word earlier. So you could be telling the story. So we pushed him under the other one. You could be pointing with your hands and making sense of this in the context, or you could do it with cotext, right? The words that appear along with the words being analyzed. If you were hearing a story and someone said, so we pushed him under the other one, the story itself would be the cotext. Because of the way I've talked today, I gave you these words earlier. Here they are again. With little definitions, right? Cotext, words that appear with the words being analyzed, appear either in spoken form or in written form, and context is the situation. Where are you and when are you, right? Good. Co-referential, I used it as well earlier, right? Another way of describing this. You may realize by now, you'll say, but didn't he say that word or didn't he use that word? Yes. Some of the words are synonymous or referring to different aspects of the same thing, right? If I ask you to describe me, you could say human, or you could say male, or you could say lecturer, or you could say husband, or you could say father, right? I am all of these. But the right word to use would depend on the question. Do you have any kids? Yes, I'm a father. Are you married? Yes, I'm a husband. That sort of thing, right? Do you have a job? Yes, I'm a lecturer. So don't go thinking that these words are entirely synonymous. It would depend on what information you're trying to provide, right? Co-referential means that both the words two large onions and the words them are co-referential. They right together, refer to something. What do the two large onions and the them refer to? Well, they both refer to that actual real thing in the world, the two large onions that the cook is actually chopping up, right? That's what you have. There are actually three things here. There's the real onions in the world that are being cut up. There's the words two large onions, and there's the word them. So two large onions and them are co-referential to the actual onions being cut up in the world. Look at the comparison here between the two sentences. You realize that they both mean the same thing, right? That cut up two large onions, put them in a cooking pot, or cut up two large onions, put the onions in a cooking pot. You've just replaced the word them with the onions. What does the onions refer to? It works the same way. You know that here the onions means not any onions. It means the two large onions that you just cut up that were mentioned in the first sentence. What we have here is a new way of saying the same thing. It's still a cohesive relation. The onions and the two large onions are cohesive. They stick together. You could say that two large onions and the onions are co-referential to the actual onions in the world. I'm saying this because sometimes people point that out. They say, but couldn't you say it this way? Couldn't you say it that way? Of course, you could change the sentences. There are other possibilities for which words use, but you can still use the same descriptive words, anaphoric, presupposition. You can still use all of those words to describe the relations between them. So although I've talked an awful lot about a pretty simple sentence, cut up two large onions, and another simple sentence, put them in a cooking pot. I've talked a lot about these, but I want you to see that you can use the terminology to discuss in generalities any other sentences that are part of any other text. To review the word anaphoric, here you could say that the here has that same function of anaphoric reference. It points, you know, when you hear the word the, that it points at something, right? Put the onions in a cooking pot. You can't just tell someone, pass me the scissors. Which scissors, right? You have to be in a kitchen where there are scissors available, or she has to be cutting with the scissors, and then you say, pass me the scissors, and she's going to assume you mean the scissors that you're holding. The onions and them and those other examples I gave, him and the other one, so we pushed them under the other one. All of these work in the same way. All of them could be described as anaphoric references in the right context or in the right context. None of this is specific to just the word them, right? We're not analyzing just the word them. We're looking at them as an example of something that happens in a much bigger picture. So what you should be able to do, at least to start to do today, and I advise you to make sure that these words in the list are words that are familiar to you, and we'll use them more often over time, and you'll become more familiar with them. And it's a reasonably long list. These are the key terms from today. You should be familiar with these words. I hope you're making notes. And you should be able to use them somewhat fluently, and you'll become more so over time. You might try it. On the next slide, I have given some example answers. Three different answers, because there's no one way, because as you saw, some of the words are synonymous, or at least depend on what is it that you're trying to describe, right? Much as I said, I could be described as both a husband or a father or a lecturer. But try it, right? Try to write one sentence using the words here. Write one sentence explaining he in this sentence, right? From a well-known story by Kafka that appears in the Metamorphosis. And you have, as Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. And you should be able to look at the word he and then apply some of the terms from this slide to the word he. Don't try to use them all. Try to write one sentence that uses just one or two of them. Practice that, right? And you'll see a few examples on the next slide that you could compare your answer to. And when the time comes, I'm not going to discuss these answers now because I want you to try making your own and then to compare them to what I have and to think about them and to think, I wrote the same as Sean, great, or I wrote something different, but I think my answer is right as well, or I wrote something and I can see why it's not right because of what Sean wrote. So I really want you to try that on your own and then take that up with me at the next opportunity. So please pause now and take some time. But obviously I'm going to move forward to the next slide as soon as I finish this sentence. Here are some possible answers for you to think about and ask me about at the next opportunity. Good. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you've understood this, and of course, ask me questions the next time we meet. Thank you very much. Bye.